thank you very much for coming here on this very warm September evening. Bee Gees, decades, the Bee Gees in the 1970s. We're here, of course, with Andrew Môn Hughes, Grant Walters, and of course Mark Crohan. Now, this is the second book in the series, and this, as the title helpfully suggests, is the Bee Gees in the 70s. Okay, so we're right at the beginning of the 1970s, and we've talked previously about the split, and now we're full flow into the sort of split era material, okay? So they wrote a massive amount of songs and recorded albums, whole albums in this period, yet none of it was released. Andrew, what happened? What went wrong? Tell us.
Tell us everything.
Tell us everything.
I love you too, Doug. Yeah. Those of you that have read the 1970s book will have realised that that chapter is horrendously long. It was an absolute nightmare to write because there is so much content and so much overlap between projects. You know, like sort of somebody would start doing something, somebody else would start doing something, then the other one would continue work on it. We did actually get a lot of product in 1970. We had Sing-A-Roo Song from Morris, we had Robin's Reign, Cucumber Castle, and then the Reformed Bee Gees put out 2 years on, towards the tail end of the year. We also got reissues of the Odessa album in the form of Sound of Love and Marley Put Drive on the Polydor 99 bonus label, budget label. But then there was all the other material which was recorded, which wasn't released. So, of course, there's the legendary Sing Slowly Sisters project by Robin, Morris and the Loner, and Barry, and what has become known as the Kids No Good. It varied in quality. Some of it was quite adventurous in terms of what Robin was doing. I know we tend to lump the demo material that he was doing for Robin's Reign in with the Sing Slowly Sisters material. So Hudson's Fallen Wind, that was quite an epic piece that he put together, which finally surfaced on when did that come out? 2015, I think it was, on the collected works Saved by the Bell, which was a very, very worthwhile project. There was some totally bizarre stuff on that. The People's Public Folk song, for crying out loud. What was that about? The band will meet Mr. Justice and things like that. But it's just great to see what was going on in Robin's mind. Like, he was just totally in overdrive, obviously driven by the speed. Morris and Barry, were on different types of substances. Barry was on the old pot, and Morris was on the pop, and their stuff seemed to be a little more kind of placid. Barry doing all the country material, and similarly with Morris, there was more structure to what Barry was doing, and some of it, although not released by him, was actually picked up by other artists over the next few years. Katja Epstein did Piece of My Mind as Frieden in Meer, which was in German. It was me dropping things this time. Peter Maffay, German artist, he did Mando Bay and another couple of songs on his second album, Du bist wie ein Lied. But that was from material from Trafalgar. Morris, he was trying to experiment with stuff, and the saving grace for Morris, I think, was having his brother-in-law Billy Laurie along as a collaborator, because Morris wasn't a very wordy person. So Billy used to write all the lyrics, sometimes credited, sometimes not. So even when we're looking at later material by Morris, things like Lay It On Me, It's Just the Way, Trafalgar, that kind of stuff, a lot of it was actually Billy that was writing lyrics on these things. Interesting thing about that is that for the single How Can You Mend a Broken Heart, which did phenomenally well in the States, lots of huge seller, number one hit, Billy made as much money as Barry and Robin on that single because of the mechanical royalties involved, because the B-side, although credited solely to Morris, was written by Billy as well, and Morris gave him his 50% for that. So Billy did really, really well out of that single specifically.
2 years on,
2 years on.
what's your opinion of the quality there? Because they brought them back together, but what do you think of the output of their material at that time, either solo or I see 2 years on as sort of musically a bit where the brothers were solo anyway. So that sort of era of the songwriting, what's your opinion? Do you think it made the grade?
I think it's aged well. My personal opinion, only in the last couple of years, I think it's aged better than I thought it did at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Because those songs, it was almost like 2 years on was like a sort of solo album. Basically, you could see that was Barry's bit, that was Robin's bit, that was Morris's bit. It felt a bit. I loved
It was so strange that Robin was even working with Morris.
very telling.
Well, how many songs in the whole career? I think is there only one song Robin and Morris have written together? That's how different that album was, and that's that is 2 years on.
Yeah.
They wrote that together, and I think it's the only song those two wrote together that's ever been recorded.
Yeah, I think there were long-standing effects from the breakup, and I don't think it ever really, sort of disappeared. I think there were always sort of remnants of that, and there was examples of some of that into the latter part of the 70s too, but or to the first half of the 70s. So, I mean, you could tell that there was still some unresolved stuff. I mean, the benefit was, as Andrew mentioned, it did really well in America. America at the time was a little bit different than Britain, and so after the 60s sort of wrapped up, America was in turmoil, and everybody became introspective. And so, after all the political and social unrest in America, the Vietnam War and things like that, people just kind of said, like, I'm tired of I'm tired of worrying about everybody else. I'm going to focus on me. And so I think they really did call it the "Gotta Be Me" era, or "Gotta Focus on Me." So that's where the the singer-songwriter vibe kind of came in. And so I think I've mentioned this before, but as they talk about lonely days and broken hearts, that was pretty good for America. So I think it resonated a lot, but not so much in Britain. So
Well, I was just about to come on to that. Thank you very much for segueing in there. Lonely Days, How He Made a Broken Heart. Massive hits in America.
Yep.
Britain, zilch.
Yep.
Okay? Now, why were people in Britain not buying Bee Gees' product? They were still household names. They were still making regular TV appearances. What went wrong in terms of their exposure on television, for example, was not translating into record sales? I mean, there was a similar situation with artists like Cilla Black. Early 70s, weekly BBC One TV show. Cliff, weekly BBC One TV show. But they were having misses as well. They weren't having a consistent run of hits. So was it just, in the Bee Gees' case, what do you think was the problem? Why were they not sort of inspiring people to rush out and buy the single?
If only we knew the answer to that. If only they knew the answer to that. It might have been a totally different story. They didn't appear to be in tune with what was going on musically. It was the era of, glam rock and stuff like that. They never wore shiny suits and stack heels and things like that.
They did in their private life,
But there was clearly a problem because they went from selling records by the truckload and just literally about a year and a half, 18 months, 20 months later, nothing.
But we touched on it in the book that correct me if I'm wrong. Early 70s were changing. The singer-songwriter came into being. Words were supposed to mean a bit more, mean a bit more. Bee Gees did not respond well to the challenge at all because Barry, particularly, grew up in the 50s where Moon and June and rhyming words. Songs like Cat Stevens and people and what's his name, Taylor?
James Taylor.
Taylor. Songs, and people wanted to search a bit more. I don't think the Bee Gees really responded well to that challenge. They seemed to miss the point. Your songs. you've got to find meaning for the words, and they themselves, they don't come from that era, and I don't think personally that they responded well to that. Didn't understand you. We're looking for more than this. Their melodies were just as good, and their harmonies were good. That's my view.
Yeah, because they switched from the band format with Colin and Vince, and
Yeah.
then they became a trio vocal group.
Yeah.
Could it be that perhaps the perception, like Cyril and Cliff say, was that they'd gone a bit showbiz? Or they were seen as a showbiz act rather than a current pop group?
Well, they were never like message band, were they? They were just, they were a pop band. They didn't see themselves, I guess they didn't take themselves seriously, but I don't think they responded well to that challenge personally. I don't know who anyone else feels, but there were exceptions like Hackney to Broken Heart. But again, if you go to a song like Israel, what the hell's that about? With Your Beautiful Sand, with the title, you think, oh, this must be interesting. But it's a great melody. It's beautifully sung. But can someone tell me what it's about? With its beautiful sand?
Yeah, they were writing songs where you would have one line, let's say, which seemed very profound, followed by another line which had absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with the line which preceded it. So there was no... As a whole, it didn't gel, but the melodies were so fantastic. And the vocals and the harmonies, that was always, top notch. But I don't know, they kind of lost the plot in terms of a lot of the writing that they were doing, and you could see that they were searching for a sound or an identity, because as much as 2 years on seemed to be this is where I came in decades earlier. You could tell this was Barry, this was Robin, this was Morris. Then in '71 they did Trafalgar, which was so totally overblown in terms of orchestra and stuff like that. Where were they going with that?
Yeah.
Because this was the era of innovation in terms of sound. You didn't want an orchestra on it. You wanted a synthesizer. You wanted a screeching Moog synthesizer or something like that on it.
I've always thought that was possibly a problem then. You've got artists like the Sweets and all that glam, and you've got David Bowie, and then you've got the Bee Gees with these very heavily orchestrated songs. People who like glam will not be going for that sort of sound.
No, but on the other hand, you had these other groups like Deep Purple, who did a Concerto for Group and Orchestra, Moody Blues, Days of Future Past, Procol Harum, live in concert with the Edmonton Symphony Orchestra and stuff like that. A lot of the prog bands were going towards more of an orchestral kind of sound, and if you couldn't afford it, we're actually kicking back into the 60s, you would be using a mellotron to emulate the sound of the strings and the flutes and stuff along those lines. So it's difficult to kind of figure where they were in the market, but what they were actually grasping for. So by doing this orchestral album, it wasn't completely in keeping with the progressive kind of bands for whom this was a new sound. This had always been part of the Bee Gees sound. But then you go to 72 and you've got this, I'll call it a mishmash, although I don't mean that in a bad way at all. It's a very diverse album. I absolutely love it to bits, to whom it may concern. And then they go into 72 and 73 and they go totally country, with Life in a Tin Can.
Yeah.
And then Mr. Natural, they come in, they bring in a new producer, and you've got a totally different sound again. That you could see that they were absolutely desperate to actually find an identity, and it took a long, long time for them to do so.
I'm sure there was a vision, of them going to Los Angeles to record Life in a Tin Can, because, at the time the Eagles were sort of rising up, and the whole California, the whole coastal sound was sort of, building, and that incorporated, country and folk and rock music and a little bit of soul music too. But, they kind of went to Los Angeles and recorded an album that they would have made in London 2 years ago. So I think that maybe Stigwood was trying to nudge them in one direction. I think they kind of got in their own way. I'm sure the breakup had a lot to do with that. I think, their confidence was shaken. I'm sure there was still some distrust. I think that maybe creatively they were still trying to figure out how to work together again because that had all kind of shaken apart. So, I think it was lots of different things. And they only kind of really figured things out in America for about a year. And then after that, things fell apart too. For a little bit. And, we talk about this down period, now if you were down and out for a couple of years, it wouldn't be a big deal. But in the 70s, I mean, that was a massive amount of time for you to have a downturn, right? And so Atlantic Records got completely impatient with them. And, they kind of had an ultimatum drop them and said, if you don't make something that's a hit, like, that's it, you're going to get dropped. And, they were pretty firm about that. So they were in a pretty tough spot. So I think that, there was a lot of pressure for them to make hits. And after they didn't have any for a couple of years,
and
I'm sure
they've
that
spoken about, they didn't know what the public wanted from them. You talked about your point before.
Yeah,
They were,
I agree.
Tell us what you want and we'll do it, rather than find their own path, which they did.
Yeah.
And they were trying to find a path, but they were, we speak about it in the book, My World. It's a beautiful song, but it's pretty lazy too. It's,
My world is your world is my world.
The harmony is beautiful, and it's beautiful melody, but...
And interesting, that was one of the few hits they had on both sides of the Atlantic.
They repeat it. So they were sort of coasting there, and it was just, it made the charts, but yeah, they were really searching at that time.
Yeah.
There was other stuff.
Was it really their fault? Because very late 60s and early 70s, musical tastes were changing.
Yeah, I agree.
What they were following on from the late 50s and 60s with harmony and nice lyrics, different generation, they didn't want that. 4 years down the line, a generation that of think to me, well, what are you listening to that rubbish for?
Yeah.
This is what I want. But 2 years down the line, something else and something else. So
Yeah.
I don't think it was their fault or a management fault. I just, when you're right, they were trying to find something that was new that the younger generation would have bought. And generation coming down thinking, but they don't know that group.
Totally agree. Yeah, I don't think it was a fault. And, when we say those things, I don't think it's, I don't think they were calculatedly sort of getting in, sinking themselves. But I think a lot of groups out of the 60s that made the transition to the 70s struggled. I mean, the Beach Boys certainly did. I think if the Beatles had stayed together, they probably would have fallen in hard times. I think only because they escaped each other did they kind of figure it out. But there are other folks too. The Hollies might be one of the examples of a group that actually did okay in the early 70s. But there are a lot of folks that didn't make the jump from the 60s to the 70s really successfully. So they weren't the only ones. And they certainly figured it out.
But bands weren't expected to last forever either.
No.
But they saw themselves lasting forever.
They did, yeah.
And all of a sudden you're right, they find themselves, we're going to last forever, what are we going to do?
Because that's no different to anybody else. Anybody else in life wants to excel at what they're doing and have people that
But most bands would split, wouldn't they?
Yeah.
But they're three brothers, they're not going to split, they're here for the lifetime gig.
Yeah.
So they've got to find their path.
Yeah.
So had it been like three non-brothers, they would have been arguing, musical differences will split. But
they weren't interested in protest songs, and they weren't interested in like Neil Young, John Taylor, and people like that. They weren't interested in that. They weren't interested in making a statement about anything. They were just interested in, they knew what road they wanted to go down, and like you said, they kept trying it. And I think really they got there in the end.
And you wonder how much, Barry didn't grow up in that area.
Yeah,
he grew up.
He didn't. He wasn't.
Yeah, he was in a romantic area. People didn't write those songs, and
No.
apart from that one you mentioned before, they didn't.
Yeah.
So they were trying to find their path. Neil Young's stuff didn't fit in. I mean, they've done a couple of things that.
Yeah.
Before we leave the sort of life in a tin can to make a certain era, Andrew, you found this book also that there was quite a few interesting projects that never came to fruition. If you could just elaborate a little bit on that.
There's so much stuff which you could write a book, The Bee Gees the Way It Should Have Been, if everything that they'd ever planned had come to fruition. A lot of the new information came from Jimmy Stevens' daughter, Jane. She was really, really helpful. So she had all the tour itineraries and stuff along those lines for the tours where Jimmy supported or was supposed to be supporting the Bee Gees. Now, one of those tours was the 1973 UK tour, which, if you were around in those days, lots of, and you were looking at the newspapers from week to week, you would notice that the number of gigs was rapidly depleting, and the final advert for it was just for one show, which was at the London Palladium. But there was another show which was advertised immediately after it, and this was the Royal Command performance, which was supposed to be held at the Royal Festival Hall in London. And this had quite a bill. John Denver was on it. The headliner was supposed to be Paul McCartney on wings. The Bee Gees were second on the bill. They'd gone so far as to actually figure out a complete set list for the Bee Gees. It was going to be with orchestra. It was going to be in the presence of Princess Anne. It was going to be with a full orchestra. They were going to record it for television broadcast globally, and they were going to record it for a live album. And the thing just died, and there was absolutely no explanation as to why it was cancelled. And this is nothing to do with the Bee Gees at all. This was at a far higher level, and we don't know why that was cancelled.
Was the actual event cancelled?
The event was cancelled. So we lost some live recordings and some live footage for that. Yeah. But also the 19th February 73 gig at the Royal Festival Hall again, supported by Colin Blunstone. That was the launch gig for RSO Records, which put Life in a Tin Can out as the first release on 1st of March 1973. So they played this gig, and there were plans to actually record this and put this out as a live album as well. The thing was that they had so much product lined up. They had Life in a Tin Can. 4 months later, they were supposed to be putting a Kick in the Head out. So they were talking about possibly putting this out in '74, but because the Bee Gees weren't selling, they didn't do it. When a Kick in the Head wasn't released, they hastily put out Best of Bee Gees 2. It was just a mishmash of, I like that word tonight, don't I?
Yeah.
It was hardly an auspicious start for RSO Records,
It wasn't. But
because I'm sure lots of people think that RSO Records was just simply Polydor in disguise. It wasn't. It was running a record company, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was a kind of vanity label, really, wasn't it? You know,
to start with, but it soon got legs.
It did, but it didn't last very long. When you actually look at things, and after the troubles which we'll go into in the 80s book, virtually overnight, lots of RSO just fired virtually everybody in all territories.
Yeah.
Lots of them, they were just running on skeleton staff. Lots of it was just a really, really strange way that it all kind of went tits up forward. Sorry, can I say that?
Yes.
Okay.
You just did.
But to touch on like their lack of direction, and Barry's just spoken fairly recently in a fairly good conversation with a New Zealand chap. He looks back at those times, they were just smoking too much. Just too much dope going around, self-indulgent a bit. It wasn't until they got literally a kick in the pants that they focused.
The kick in the pants came after the kick in the pants.
Yeah.
Because we're here, we're now sort of like, with Best of Bee Gees Volume 2, was the Batley experience before or after that?
After.
That was
After, okay,
yeah.
So we've now got the bit which the Gibb brothers used to bring up time and time again as the low point of their career. Psychologically, that must have affected them.
It was strange, because they were touring successfully everywhere else.
Yeah.
Lots of 71, they did the States, they did Australia. 72, they did the States, they did Australia, they did the Far East, they did Japan. 73, they didn't do Australia in 73, didn't they? But they did the States.
And Japan opened up as a market for them. It was a big selling. Mm-hmm. So they're earning good dollars from the tours.
They even played a couple of gigs in Italy in 1971, which resulted in big hits with My World and Run to Me, but was the end of the line for Jeff Bridgeford. They were the two final gigs that he played, but he'd had enough of the deal. They said there was too many drugs about at that time.
Well, there's that news conference footage of them And they got off the plane and they were all completely bombed.
Yeah.
It's on YouTube. I commend it to you if you watch it. They're actually clearly completely out of it.
Was that the one in Australia?
Yeah.
Yeah.
They are really out of it.
What am I searching for?
Bombed out Bee Gees. Yeah. So, what do you actually think that it's speeded up? Because I don't know, the volumes of coke they must have consumed that day. They were really talking kind of speed it up, weren't they?
Yeah, and then Robin went really slow and started flapping his arms around.
Oh, we'll get on to the dancing later.
Okay. But Mr. Natural, okay, after around that time of battling, Mr. Natural came along. Now, I always used to be a bit down on Mr. Natural because I don't think I actually properly listened to it, But actually, I think it's one of their strongest albums, with the luxury of, listening to it again and again. Arif Marden, another person who's come along and sort of given them confidence. He's opened their ears to new production methods, perhaps. An American slant on producing.
Yeah.
So, Mr. Natural, even though the album didn't really sell, there's actually some decent stuff on there, and it really does perfectly lead into main chorus with their firing all cylinders.
Yeah, it's a great album. So I think Arif probably, in addition to being, as I mentioned before, a really experienced producer. I mean, he'd worked for Atlantic for 20 years at that point. And of course, he worked with Aretha Franklin, he worked with Hall & Oates, he worked with Average White Band, among others.
It's not Bingo the Fourth, that was a terrible album.
Yeah, right. True. But I think Arif probably also brought some discipline into the studio. So I think the effing around they were doing with drugs and probably stopped. And I don't know if you noticed, Barry's voice, the difference between how he sounds in 1973 and how he started to sound in 1974, remarkably different. He had more control over his voice. Yeah. It was richer. I think Robin too. Robin sings differently on Mr. Natural than he did on past albums. So whatever he was doing was clearly making a difference in the studio. So even though it wasn't a success, you listen to that album and there's just the cohesion is so much better on that album than in past. So whatever he was doing, but he probably, in addition to, I think, being a really supportive, sort of paternal figure as well, they really looked up to him. I think he probably shook him up a little bit and said, listen, you got to get serious.
Price for him too.
Yeah.
Well, let's face it, like when George Harrison brought Billy Preston into the studio to ease the tensions of the Let It Be era, perhaps having Arif Marden there made them be almost on their best behaviour.
I think so.
And cut out some of the crap.
Yeah, because I think he probably gave them a reality check and said, listen, if you don't do well, this album doesn't go.
And Arif Marden wouldn't have been cheap either.
No, he wouldn't have been.
They couldn't afford to waste any time with him.
Atlantic with a charge.
They wouldn't be able to frig around and come in doped out late in the afternoon.
But I think he appealed to them because they love soul and R&B music, and they certainly had elements of it. I mean, you can't write a song like "To Love Somebody" and not have soul, right? So the Bee Gees had it, but I think probably for a long time they probably believed that it wasn't correct for them to sing that way. But Hall & Oates, it was a good example. Arif worked with them in 73, and so abandoned Luncheonette when they did She's Gone, which was sort of a blueprint for Fanny Be Tender With My Love, by the way. Lots of similarities. But, so you had experience working with white acts and making them sound a little bit more soulful. So working in that blue-eyed soul sort of vein, and Mr. Natural sort of goes in that direction. And so I think he really started to kick in some confidence into being, you can do this. That's okay. It's allowable. So maybe get lost in a little bit and see what happens. But it took them a while because, even the first bits of Main Course, the sessions for that, weren't really successful. So he definitely had to do some stuff to get through to them. But yeah, he was instrumental. If Arif had not come, if Stigwood had not hired Arif to come in and work with them or suggest or make that connection, then I think that they would have been toast. Yeah.
Two things about Mr. Natural, it's a fan favourite. The Gibbs, whenever they talk about their songs, they don't really talk about their lack of the non-successful albums, but it's a fan favourite, and it's almost a farewell to the old Bee Gees, isn't it? It's But does anyone can I put a show of hands who likes Mr. Natural?
Vocally, it's sublime.
Yeah.
It's the go-to.
And you said it, the power in Barry's voice especially, it's
Beautiful.
But in terms of the singles that were released, they didn't capitalise on that. putting Charade out as a single just didn't seem to make sense. It didn't make sense as the opening track on the album.
Yeah.
If I bought that album at the time and played that song, I'd have been, there'd
We
been
must record shop to play it before you decided to buy it.
yeah,
They look like
there'd have been
Charade's album.
trepidation of do I part with my money?
Yeah.
They should have been putting stuff out like Down the Road should have been a single from that album.
Yeah.
It would have been a ball buster, that one. That would have shocked everybody.
At this point, I'm going to move things slightly on a bit now. I want to get into the sort of final, because there's plenty to talk about here. We've got main course onwards now. We've got Aviv Martin, who's back again as producer. 4-6 Revolution Boulevard, Eric Clapton, Go to Miami, that sort of thing. So that's it is a sensational album. Again, it didn't do anything in Britain, but it really is a Bee Gees masterpiece, in my humble opinion. Now, they obviously went from Mr. Natural to this, but what do you think gave that extra something which main course has, which got hits?
Well, I think the environment was huge for them, and so we discussed this whole idea of Eric Clapton, and I think we all agree did not actually make the suggestion for them to go to Miami. Eric Clapton was off a 3 or 4 year heroin binge, so I think he got sent to Miami and saying, listen, you need to, Stigwood funded that, by the way, and let him be on drugs for a few years, and then said, okay, you got to go and make me a good album. So they sent him to Miami, and obviously came up with 461 Ocean Boulevard, which is a great record. I just listened to it the other day. Still a great album. So I think the environment had a huge impact on that. And you think about what was happening in Miami, and it was bumping. I mean, Casey and the Sunshine Band had just sort of started having hits. TK Records figured into the equation. Albie Galutin knew a lot of folks, and Carl Richardson knew folks from TK Records. Joey Mercia was part of that environment that played later on Andy's albums and things like that as well. So they were really starting to push singles onto American radio, especially. And so that was the whole birth of, this soulful sort of up-tempo, the roots of commercial disco. I won't say that it's the roots of actual disco.
With the Bee Gees themselves, though, of course, we have the arrival of Blue Reaver.
Yeah.
Now, how important do you feel was, Andrew, I'll direct this one to you, how important do you feel was Blue Reaver's arrival on the scene?
It was the first time the Bee Gees band, if you like, had actually included a keyboard player. Previously, you'd had Vincent Collin in there, sort of on drums and bass, and of course Alan Kendall became a permanent fixture, and then Dennis Bryan. But they'd never actually had a full-time keyboard player in the band. Jeff Wesley obviously played drums, but he was also the conductor on 74 tour for them. So he wasn't actually, Bee Gees band. This is where that three-man unit sort of became an integral part of the sound. And a keyboard player, sort of as Robin over there, sort of can attest, can make a hell of a difference to a band sound.
Oh yeah, the best.
Yeah. No, but the thing is, you don't generally get a classically trained drummer. You don't frequently get a classically trained guitarist going into rock music. But most rock keyboard players, you look at Keith Emerson and John Lord, and people like that, they're all classically trained. Luna can probably have a word or two about that kind of stuff as well. So Blue, obviously, classically trained, he can bring lots of different ideas, fancy new chord shapes and stuff like that into play. It was like George Bitzer when he got involved with Barry. The sounds on Now Voyager, for instance, were totally different to anything that they'd ever come up with before. So Blue obviously added a hell of a lot to things. Blue also could write music. So he would fiddle about and do this, that, and the other. And Songbird, obviously, was the first thing that he contributed to it.
And that was as a songwriter.
I think Blue should have been credited as a songwriter on a hell of a lot more stuff, to be quite honest with you.
A lot, yeah.
But there's that one, and then the way it was. Our Love, Don't Throw It All Away, and stuff like that. And of course, a lot of the stuff from the Jimmy Ruffin album back in 1980. So Blue, I think, was absolutely critical to the mix. The stuff that they started recording during those first few days in January. It was a little pedestrian. Lots of it.
It wasn't very good.
It didn't really kind of progress. And they were told, go away, have a think about things. And I don't see main course as drastically different, because you look at Country Lanes and Come On Over and stuff like that. That's still full-blown country. Those wouldn't have been out of tune on Life in a Tin Can, you know. But it was things like Jive Talking, lots of which kind of set it aside. Winter Change, Nights on Broadway. Those were the songs, lots of which really had big impact.
Yeah.
The opening 4 tracks of Main Course, in my view, is strongest they've ever done.
Yeah.
The lead album was
They
as
really
good as Bee Gees' first, and only, I'm jumping ahead here, only Spirits Having Flown, the first 3-4 songs, that was so strong.
Yeah, they're very strong.
Yeah.
And I love I don't know about, interrupt, sorry. I love the energy of that song too. I mean, we'll talk about Children of the World, but you can see you almost feel the excitement and the confidence they're getting as they're writing these songs.
And of course, that leads us perfectly to probably the most famous BG element of them all, the falsetto.
Oh yeah.
That was unleashed on the world.
Yeah.
Was it?
Well-
Was it unleashed upon the world in 1975?
Oh, details. Actually,
Details.
everyone knows it's. Everyone thinks of that late '70s period as Barry Gibb and the falsetto.
It goes back much further than that.
Yeah,
They were using.
Well, we were listening to Dogs in the car on the way over here, and you can clearly hear it on, in some of the verses. Yeah, and then yes,
again?
voices, just like that. But I mean, they've been using falsetto for years. Now, do I think they were using it with the kind of sort of panache and the, sort of the nuance that I think Arif sort of absolutely not. So I think that again, I think discovering the falsetto there probably was a misnomer. I think they definitely refined it. And I think Arif probably pushed Barry and said, I think you should use this here because I think it's a textural element. You should try it out. But I mean, the first person to use a lead falsetto was Robin. 1972, when they first recorded "It Doesn't Matter Much to Me," right? That was an amazing song, right? And Robin blew the roof out. I don't love the song. It's kind of a weird, but the outro of that song, I mean, just phenomenal. So I mean, if we're talking about first, that's really what it was. But I think Arif taught them about how to use falsetto weaved into other elements, and I think that's what he did on Main Course. And I don't know that. I think, as Andrew mentioned, I don't think it's that drastically different. But I think the discipline on that album. Carl was talking to me about how Arif disciplined the band to learn how to play together, because when they got in there, you have Dennis and Blue and Alan and everybody else in there. They were excited. There's a lot of pressure on them too. I mean, that was a make or break record, and so I think there was a lot of emotion happening. But he talked about how Arif had to set a click track and force Dennis to stay on rhythm, and how the vocals had to stay on rhythm. And so he was talking about how he really had to push them to say, like, you are going to spend time with each other. You have to learn how to sync. You have to learn how to play together as a band if you're going to be a band. So I think that what you're hearing on Main Course, again, is just refining what was already there. And so when they did that in the studio, and people were really pissed off at him too. So, Dennis and Blue did not like that kind of, sort of regimented stuff. But Arif was like, listen, this is important. You've got to learn how to do it if you want to learn to play together as a band. And so that's what happened. And they eventually... stuff started clicking, and that's where Nights on Broadway came from, or sorry, Lights on Broadway first came from, and that's where Jive Talking came from. It was that rhythm they had. It was right there, but it took work. It took a lot of work.
And that's a very interesting point, because I'm enjoying this conversation, because how often when the Bee Gees are mentioned do we have people talking about the music?
Yeah.
If you see what I mean? And it's really interesting, because the points you make there makes me now want to go and listen to Main Course all over again. Another thing, we were talking about falsetto, and of course, as you say, they used falsetto previous to the Main Course album. Jive Talking, it was a really important single for them, and there's that tired old story about them going over the bridge. Do you believe that that's possible, or whether that's just a rather good PR story?
No, I think it's possible. I don't know that it happened in the way that they probably thought it did. We've had some discussion about this, but also Carl Richardson thinks it happened in a limo going over 125th Street Bridge. Barry said it happened on the Julia Tuttle Causeway driving in his Jeep. Some people say Linda came up with the title of it and said, oh, it's the drive talking, there's stuff like that. So again, it's one of those things about the Gibb brothers and probably other bands too, where, eventually once you spin a yarn and you keep talking about it, it becomes a reality.
It was a drive talking story for
Because I actually tested it because I went to Miami a few years ago and I drove on the Julia Tuttle Causeway, no sound. I was like, well, this is bullshit.
That's dedication. That is dedication.
But anyway, so I think
forensically researched.
Forensically researched.
That's on that banner.
These guys are messing around.
I think yes. I think it did happen in some version. But whatever it was. But Alan also talks about how Alan Kendall talked in the documentary, the How Can You Mend a Broken Heart documentary, about how Arif asked him, could you do the chicken picking sound with the chicken? And so that was probably part of him too. So, yes, in some version, maybe not quite the way that they originally said it did, but sure.
Children of the World. Now, Arif Mardin was out of the picture due to record company politics. Well, not record company politics. Robert Stigwood switched distribution from Atlantic in the US to Polygram. So Arif was gone for business reasons. So the Bee Gees were back doing it themselves again. There was Carl and Albie, of course. But
Yes.
given what you've said about Main Course, do you feel that Children of the World improved on that, or was it just more of the same, or a step back? What's your opinion of that album? Because
It's not my favourite album, but I love the enthusiasm in it. I just feel they've got a confidence they haven't had for years. They've found their groove. Song by Size is not my favourite. I think, You Should Be Dancing, brilliant, and there's a few others. I like the album, but to me you can almost taste they must have been bursting to get back into the studio. I don't know how you feel, but I just love it. They've found their groove. Let's go for it.
You Should Be Dancing also was a hit in the UK, folks. I'm sure all of you remember it. But equally, at a time when people were not buying Bee Gees albums, singles like Jive Talking and You Should Be Dancing burst through and became big hits.
They were big hits.
The albums weren't selling, so people didn't hear the single go, right, I'm going to go out and get Main Course, or I'm going to go out and get, that album. But as you say, whatever they were doing was working, at least on the singles.
And there's a funny trivia question. If you ever ask anybody, they'll say, name the only song that Stephen Stills played, a number one song that Stephen Stills played on.
You Should Be Dancing. Yeah.
It Should Be Dancing.
Yeah, he's and Carl and Albie talked to me about this a little bit. So what they were missing when they moved from Main Course to Children of the World was the musical know-how of how to get things done in the booth, in the production booth. So Arif was a big player and could do. He did everything. He was a great instrumentalist. He was great with an orchestra. He could conduct. He was, a mastermind of production. He could figure all that out. And so they had the raw materials, and I think the Bee Gees knew how to make a good record, but I don't think they knew exactly how to translate stuff into musical terms to get the band to sort of gel. And so Albie kind of walked in, and Albie Galutin, and there was sort of the answer. Albie had the musical discipline. He had played with enough bands. He played with the Beatles, the Eagles and things like that, and Eric Clapton, and knew how to sort of mesh stuff together. So he was a good songwriter, good keyboardist, as well as being classically trained at the Berklee School of Music. So he was innovative. Albie's a genius. If any of you ever have the chance to talk to Albie, just mind-blowing stuff that he's done. He's a true. I don't know how he does it. He's just brilliant. So he was really instrumental. And Carl was great. Was a great engineer, and he started to have input as well. And he said, I started thinking about You Should Be Dancing, and I'm like, that drum beat you're playing is weird. Like, it needs something, but I don't know how to tell you how to do that. And so that's where Carl kind of came in.
And maybe talking about the relationship between the three of them too. It grew, just particularly Barry and the other two.
Yeah, well, I think they really became in sync, and Barry was learning a lot. He learned a lot from Arif, but he was learning a lot from Albie and Carl too. And I think eventually the three of them just clicked, and they had a way of being able to communicate where they didn't even have to sort of talk. They could just sort of nod and acknowledge that something was good or something needed work. And so more so. They did say Children of the World was a group effort. Everybody contributed. People were active. Robin and Morris were actively writing, singing, helping with the production and things like that. And that was probably for a while their last sort of real true group effort.
Yeah.
So, but then, right after Children of the World, Andy started to come into the picture. And so I Just Want to Be Your Everything was their first sort of outside of the Bee Gees, kind of production. And by the time they got there, I mean, they were already in sync. But it was that and Emotion that they did with Samantha Sang, where Albie was sort of like, that's sort of where Barry started to think like, oh, I've got all these session musicians. I can tell them exactly what I want them to play. I can make them sound this way here. And isn't that great? I don't have to ask the band for input. And so even though there was that cohesion with, Blue and Dennis and Alan with the brothers, he started seeing some of the benefits. And so he's like, that was sort of the point where, things started to go, in a different direction.
As a fan, I'm sort of sitting here now thinking, excuse me, Morris?
Yeah.
Yeah.
If they're not using him on keyboards, if they're not using, his musicianship skills or arranging skills, I feel kind of demoted.
Yeah.
So I think that's another one of those little things that sort of cause problems later on down the
You did.
line.
Yeah.
I think it's been written before that Morris struggled to find his place at this stage. Where do I fit in? All of a sudden, these two are often there. Where does Morris fit in? He's always a fairly insecure chap anyway, lacking confidence. And Robin would come in and apparently act as very successfully as almost like an executive producer.
Yeah.
Do this, do that. Even though he hadn't been there all day, he was quite concise about it.
He was a good editor, could read out the rubbish.
Yeah.
Morris was also in bad shape in terms of his alcoholism was, getting to him. He also had back issues and stuff.
We're not going to go down a personal thing.
No.
Which came first? Was it the alcohol, meaning that he wasn't contributing, or was it that he was upset at being sidelined? That it could be.
I from what I understand, I think the booze got in the way, more than anything. And so I think, they got to the point where, by the time they got to Spirits Having Flown and they were on the tour, I mean, they would have Morris playing on stage and they would unplug him and have a session person off stage playing his part because he was too out of it. So I think that started to interfere, with that pretty regularly from what I understood. So unfortunate, but that was a reality.
I'm one of 6 children, but I often wonder, when you've got siblings, their strengths, usually their weaknesses. I often wonder, did Huey and Barbara ever say, look after Morris? Does he know? Did Barry ever realise that he lacked that self-esteem?
I don't know.
I don't know. I don't know the answers to it, but I often wonder, did he realise that Morris needed an occasional pat in the back?
Maybe.
I don't know.
Yeah. Okay, now the doors are locked, everybody. You can't leave. We're going to have to mention that film. Okay? Saturday Night Fever.
It gets worse. We've got the other film to talk about after as well.
Oh, are we?
But okay, let's just dive in and go for it. We've now reached, of course, after Children of the World, we've now reached the Saturday Night Fever era, okay? Where to begin? Okay, now, they were filming the Sergeant, if I'm right, they were filming the Sergeant Pepper's movie. The Saturday Night Fever, was it How Deep Is Your Love came out, or the soundtrack album came out around that time while they were making the Pepper film?
Yeah, December.
December of 77.
Yeah, and things just went apeshit for them.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it was sort of a perfect storm. It was, people are always interested to find out, and I know all of you know this, but the fact that those songs were recorded in France in isolation, early in 77, there were these songs that sort of had these New York City undertones. I think a lot of people, the fact that they were recording this at like an abandoned chateau in the middle
chateau, as they call it.
rural France was sort of mind-boggling to them, because I think a lot of people still assumed that they were written for the film, and they weren't. I mean, they had nothing to do with anything at that point in time. But I found something out. There was something really interesting that Travolta had said. John Travolta had been on American Bandstand late in '76, and he was talking about. When You Should Be Dancing was #1, and was talking about, I'm making this movie soon that's going to be about a guy who dances in a disco. And so that was really interesting. And that, so we wonder sort of that was the impetus, because that week they played You Should Be Dancing as the #1 single on Bandstand. And so we thought maybe that he discovered that then and said, I want to dance to this song. And so that was interesting. We don't know if that's actually true, but it was he'd sort of interrupted their new studio album and said, Stigwood said, like, I've got this film idea. And everybody thought it was a terrible idea. And nobody really wanted to make Saturday Night Fever, but Robert Stigwood was convinced. And, once he was convinced, nobody sort of talked him down. And so they kind of got on it, and that was, the rest is sort of history. But I don't think anybody really thought that was a good idea at the time.
Stigwood's extraordinary. I was talking about it before, he had his faults too, but I'll jump a bit to Greece. He buys a stage play for Greece. It's been relatively successful, but he thinks he needs a few songs. So he gets the two hottest songwriters in the world, John Farrar, who's Olivia Newton-John's producer-writer, and Barry Gibb, top and tail.
Yeah.
Stigwood, and like the songs were strong in themselves, but not hit-wise. And
yeah,
that's the Stigwood. To me, that's the brilliance of Stigwood.
Yeah, I totally agree. But what were we talking about? Oh, Fever.
Yeah.
It's a really hard film to watch. We were talking about this. I don't think you've seen it all the way through, have you?
I watched it a couple of weeks ago.
Oh, did you?
Again, like, it's not that I haven't watched it.
It's a very dark film, isn't it?
It's very dark. Oh my gosh.
It's
Yeah, and the things the characters do in the film, they're not the sort of, you don't walk out of the cinema thinking that they were heroes. There's quite well, watching them, some really
It's not nice.
problematic stuff in that film.
There's a lot of
what some of the characters do to each other and so forth, for want of a better phrase. But for such a massive album, the actual film, which it was from, was actually, it certainly wasn't child friendly. They had to actually edit it, didn't they? And bring out a cut version.
But not till 2 years later, and so they brought it out in '79. So I mean, it was in its full form. I mean, they had a rape scene in it, which I was not.
I was skirting around that issue there, actually.
which was, that was really. That was really not done before in cinema, right? And so, but also, I mean, there was a tremendous amount of racism and misogyny and homophobia in that movie too. I mean, it was all, and it was really a reflection of what was going on at the time in New York. New York was struggling in the '70s. It's not what it is now. And so that was the son of Sam, was happening. So people were really scared for their safety. It reflected what was happening, in New York at the time. So it was accurate, which I think was, kind of frightening. But but it was. But for whatever reason, they found a way to mesh this music that the Bee Gees had created for their next studio album. They made it fit amazingly well. I mean,
disco, was it?
No, it was
disco. But those songs that did disco, but they were lumped in with the disco.
Well, they suited disco, but it's R&B. Yeah.
If
you could dance to it if you wanted to.
You could.
I didn't.
Yeah.
No.
Want to.
Yeah. And also the Bee Gees output of that era didn't have all those stupid noises.
Syndromes.
No, it was.
The Bee Gees were unlike other disco guys. The Bee Gees were never camp. They were never disco-y in that sense, but they get lumped in with all of that.
No. Well,
And the thing is, it's become an albatross around the neck, hasn't it? To the man in the street, if we go out there now and we'll say to them, what are the first things that spring to your mind when you think of the Bee Gees? What are the answers going to be? So big hair, big teeth, high voices, white suits, hairy chests, medallions. I was 6, by the way. But they will name 3 of those 6 things. You ask them to name as many Bee Gees songs as they can. What will they come up with? Staying Alive will be the top one. And they'll be doing that when they say it. And you tell them, no, it wasn't the right song. That was Night Fever. But How Deep Is Your Love, Night Fever, Tragedy. Maybe You Win Again. But there will hardly be anything before, unless you're of a certain age. And youngsters, certainly won't have a clue about anything apart from that 77, 78 era.
Because that's stuck in the pop culture zeitgeist. It's
you ask those people in the street to name as many Bee Gees albums as they can, and they won't be able to name a single one. All you'll get there will be Saturday Night Fever, which wasn't a Bee Gees album. It was a movie soundtrack. So, but that's where they're at. They're focused on that era, and that's it. It was good for them, but it was extremely bad for them as well. You know?
Now, the interesting thing about that, you just mentioned that that was a soundtrack album, and you mentioned that it's hard to for people to name individual Bee Gees albums. There were only two, in the UK, there were only two not big hits, sorry, I backtracked. There were only two charting Bee Gees albums in the 70s, titled, the Bee Gees. There was Cucumber Castle, which scraped in to the bottom half of the top 50. And there was one more album, which was Spirits Having Flown.
Yeah.
So that was a massive gap.
A huge gap. Yeah.
Album-wise, because when I was a new fan, I looked in the Guinness chart history book thing, and I was shocked at how few of their albums were in. I thought they'd all be there. You know? But we're on that Spirits Having Flown, okay? Saturday Night Fever has just nuclear exploded, and then they've got to go and do a difficult follow-up to Saturday Night Fever. Do you feel that they actually nailed it, or whether there was too much falsetto, or what's your sort of going through it again for the book, listening again for the book? What's your sort of takeaways from that album?
Yes and yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
It was.
It's Grant's favourite album. It's my least favourite.
Yeah. I still love it.
It's a masterpiece of production. It really, really is. I can still listen to it. I can still love it. Yes, probably there was too much falsetto on it. Robin should have sung more falsetto.
Yeah.
I just live for that moment in Living Together when, like, sort of he gets his section. There's more depth to Robin's falsetto than there is to Barry's. Barry seems very thin compared to it. And it's just
underused. Both of them are sort of underused in that era.
Yeah.
But there again, like, sort of getting back to Morris and his bass playing. If you look at the credits on that album, Harold Cowart gets the credit for the bass on it, because Morris was pretty much redundant in the studio. It's almost the case of Ringo and Paul McCartney, sort of where the story goes that Paul McCartney would go into the studio and replay the drums, sort of on Beatles records. So it was the same with Morris. Playing his bit, okay, forget that, Harold, get in here, let's do this.
Well, the Spirits album, there was still that production team with Bee Gees and Carly. They were absolutely, they were just
For the first time, he had an absolute, because of the success of Staying Alive. I said it's not a favourite album of mine, but I get they had the budget; they can do what they want.
Yeah.
Barry was given, what do you need? You've sold 40 million copies, whatever it is. He had the budget; he could do whatever he wants. And these are kids in a candy store.
Yeah.
Particularly Barry's his studio. That's his airship.
Yeah.
He could do what he wants, and I get that. But this is my personal view is, I love the Bee Gees because of their natural harmonies. And basically, the three voices around a single guitar is what I love. So in some ways, it's the antithesis of what I love about the Bee Gees. Having said that, the first four of those songs on that album are so strong, so brilliantly produced.
They're really great.
But I miss their natural voices.
First four or fifth?
Oh, but first four particularly strong. Bang, 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 bang. And it's as good as Main Course opening. But that's just a personal view. And I understand where Grant comes from. He loves the sonic sound, the sonic song.
Oh, I think somebody said to me it's a producer's sort of, wet dream, which is crude, but it's true. They spared no expense, and but they had the luxury. They really had to do nothing to promote Saturday Night Fever. That was a self-propelling rocket ship, right? And so, they got to spend from, February of '78 through November of '78 just holed up in Criteria doing, all the work on that. And so, they had the luxury of time and money, but also innovation. The toys they purchased, the different synthesizers, the different, pieces of technology. They really, they really maximized it and used them in every single way that they possibly could. So, and again, Barry, Albie, and Carl clicked completely. They basically made the album. I think Robin and Morris were somewhat accessories. I've had lots of arguments with other fans about that, but it's true. And they gladly, I think, stepped back because they wanted hits.
Yeah.
That was the most important thing to them at the time, is that they wanted hit singles. And Barry's voice, whether or not you think he overused the falsetto, was the voice of that generation.
Yeah.
Everybody wanted that voice. Everybody wanted the voice on the records. Everybody wanted to sound like him. The Rolling Stones tried to sound like him.
Yes.
Everybody tried to sound like him.
Because
so-
Cliff had,
Yeah.
it's
Leo
funny,
Sayer.
we don't talk anymore. He's
Yeah.
doing the falsetto bits as well.
Absolutely.
Jagger, I miss you.
Yeah, Miss You and Emotional Rescue and stuff like that. Or there was no doubting who they were trying to emulate. The Eagles tried to make, their long run, and it was Country Spirits Having Flown. I mean, it was, so I think you can have a criticism of the falsetto being excessive, but I mean, they weren't going to stop. I mean, it made zero sense for them to regress and say, well, we're not going to use that on this record. But so I think it's a very cool album.
Yeah.
Can I say something? Can you tell the story that when Grant talks to Elby and Carl about specific songs?
Oh, yeah, well,
Please, yeah.
I mean, Albie and Carl, as I mentioned, are really bright people. They will remember every technical aspect. They can't remember titles. And so, Albie and I were talking. He's like, what was the ballad that was the hit from Spirits? And I was like, Too Much Heaven? He's like, yeah, that one. But Carl can remember the width of the tape that he used and a 3-second splice of Stop, Think Again. So, I mean, their brains just working. So the amount of information we got about Spirits for this book was, just incredible. And I think they had a blast making it. And I think that really showed when they brought it out.
It's a good record. The energy on there.
It is really, and everybody wanted to make a Spirits Having Flown after that. People were lined up outside Criteria to get into that studio because they're like, whatever the hell is happening in there, like, we want that too. And Spirits, I think, unfortunately, it doesn't have a great shelf life because the Bee Gees really haven't talked about it since then. They like Too Much Heaven, but they really didn't. And it sort of happened in that weird valley between Saturday Night Fever and the Backlash part, and so it kind of got lost. But Spencer Gibb and I were talking one night, and he's like,
Name dropper.
I know, but he's like, do me a favor. I want you to go listen to Michael Jackson's song "Bad." And tell me what you think. And so I went and played it, and we came back and talked again, and he's like, what did you think? And I'm like, I don't understand what you were asking me to do. And he's like, and the whole world wants to ask me right now because I tell you once again. He's like, what does that sound like? And I'm like, no stern unturned, no hell, no fury gonna stop. So, I mean, the influence of Spirits Having Flown lasted well into the 80s. I mean, U2 loved that album, Jackson loved that album, Madonna loved that. I mean, there were a lot of folks who gave it a lot of credit. So even though it was a bit of a controversial Bee Gees album, and I don't think the Bee Gees really talked it up, much after that.
It sold 15, 20 million copies?
30.
Something like that.
Yeah, it was,
Yeah.
I think Barry spoke of it as a relative failure, even though it was following.
Ridiculous.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I mean, it had a long-lasting influence, and so a lot of people built music off of Spirits, even though, it sort of, Spirits, right after Love You Inside Out was finished, I mean, it was done. And so it was a very interesting album in that way. The biggest selling album of their careers, but the one that they really don't talk about a whole bunch, which I found odd.
Yeah.
But,
It was always Main Course that we
Always
always went
Main
a bit more
Course.
detail on, wasn't
Yep.
it? That was the album they liked to talk about in terms of the creative process.
very much so.
But I mean, have you ever heard the Bee Gees go in depth about, I don't know, one album or sizes and everything? They just didn't really discuss it, did they?
Not really. No.
Well, we've got Spirits Having Flown. Then, of course, after that there was the big tour,
Yeah.
and that
Big world tour.
world
It's like the baseball World Series, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And America had it. That was it.
And a little bit of Canada, a couple of Canadian dates, in there, but that's about it. So technically,
you
international.
got nothing.
Yeah, and then
You got absolutely nothing. But
They were still stung after Batley. They were still smarting after that. I don't know. What did they?
But doesn't it go back to where they were in 72, 73? What's my direction now?
Yeah.
The crowds haven't, they don't like us anymore. What's our direction?
how do you follow that?
Yeah. What do they want from him? They don't. And also there was the backlash, which happens rarely, but occasionally.
They were blamed for all the crap disco records.
They were.
Yeah.
They were blamed by association, and so I mean they were the faces of those few years, and so in particular in North America, I mean they were being played. I mean I remember as a kid, and I was three when Spirits Having Flown came out, and I still remember hearing them a lot on the radio. So they got blamed, I think, unfortunately and unfairly. The disco backlash really was about race and culture.
It was racism, homophobia.
Absolutely, it was. Yeah, and I've said this a couple of times before that the real victims of the disco era were not the Bee Gees. They were, the artists, the diverse artists that were recording and had a platform, to share their music that eventually got.
And became popular and be heard in all the nightclubs and on the radio.
Yeah.
It's like, oh no, this must be stopped.
It ended careers, and so lots of artists who had a platform in the 70s after disco disappeared or supposedly ended. It was over for them. At least the Bee Gees had enough money, they had enough time, energy, resources, and cachet in the industry. They had a lot of respect from musicians. The media did not love them at the time, but I think artists still wanted to work with them, and so that's where you get Streisand coming. Streisand. It's not Z. Streisand. And other folks wanting to work with them, and so they had the ability to pivot, which was really good for them. And so even though it wasn't, they were smart enough to go look at everything that was happening and say like, okay, we're going to take a break. Like we need to clearly go do something else. So at least they were smart enough to figure that out, and take a step away and go do something else.
And they had the dolls to indulge themselves too.
They did, yeah. They had the
take
money.
a breath, enjoy their families.
Yeah, that's when they went out and bought Middle Ear and kitted it out and stuff like that. But they also had the big trouble with Stigwood.
Yes.
And then this is where it all kind of collapsed with regards to RSO and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But like I said, that's another story.
Well, that is definitely another story. And this is a good point now to throw out to the audience. Do you have any questions? Any questions at all? Why are you all Bee Gee'd out for the evening?
No,
Can I ask,
please.
what's your feedback on the books? What did you like, what didn't you like? Can I ask you a question?
Oh, we're doing that? No, just kidding. Please.
Is there anything you didn't like? Was it what you thought it might be?
Well, I was going to say what I do like, and that is something you brought up early on with 60s, is that you talk about the music and not necessarily the personal things unless they were related to
Yeah.
music. And somebody needed to do that without sort of dragging into the gossip and all of that stuff, which if you ask different people, they have different versions of all of that. Hard enough to get what the same version of all the songs are, much less all the gossip. And I love that that's what the focus is. So, and that to me is what I wanted. I want to know, okay, what did they do for this? And how did they get that sound? Or what, were they all together on this? I mean, I like all those types of things.
Yeah. We had to talk about Andy to some extent and some of the issues that he was, experiencing near the end of the 70s, and that was hard to do. And talk about Morris too. I mean, but at some point it did impact the music,
Right.
And
that's
certain
why you brought
things,
it up.
certain things had to be done
Makes
to it.
sense, yeah.
So that was hard to do. But Andy, we didn't talk a lot about Andy this evening, but nobody talks about Andy's music, which I think is really shitty, actually. So we wanted to do that a little bit in these books too, even though he's not sort of the main feature of the copy. But that was important for us to make sure that we talked about some of his music and how those records got made too, because they were really good and he was talented.
Yeah, we treated him respectfully too, because he was talented.
But was he actually, I mean, they said recently, but was he actually going to join the Bee Gees, or was that something that got...
I don't know that was ever going to happen. I don't know that, and again, I can only speculate, but I don't know that, I think maybe at some point, had he not gotten into drugs and had he not experienced some of the issues that he did, maybe that would have been talked about, but at some point he became a liability, and, I think once Barry had to sort of intervene and make a record almost without him, I think that maybe sealed his fate. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I think no, but that's just my own personal opinion.
From my understanding, there's always competition between Barry and Robin for the lead vocal, and Morris would get his song too. To bring in Andy,
you'd have.
my understanding is that
Can
Robin.
you imagine a Bee Gees concert with Andy? Now, what if you got Barry, Robin, and Morris, lots of them, and they're stuck to their spots. They're rooted to their spots. Andy, lots of when he got that microphone in his hand, lots of he was traversing left and right. He was all over the stage. It would have brought a totally different dynamic to it, and I don't think Barry would have tolerated it, no matter how much he loved about Andy.
Andy was a great showman. I mean,
that's
my
the
God, the
goal.
charisma and the stage presence he had. I mean, he had that in spades. I mean, he was fantastic.
And the politics about having a lead vocal. Now with the younger brother coming out, when he won his 2 or 3 lead songs, can you just imagine? Family dynamics.
Yeah, it would have been
How
hard.
they've done the 60s songs with, 3-part.
Yeah.
They're just...
Yeah. It would have been hard.
But they
He'd have been the stooge.
they said
Well,
he was
Morris
going to be
used
on
to
one, but I don't know how it was going to work out.
Yeah.
It's strange that they mentioned it after he died, because they said
That's
that.
what I was getting.
Yeah, lots of it's. After he died, they said that yes, lots of that the next album we were going to record, lots of that he would have become a BG, lots of and.
But we were talking about this last night. Andy had his first 7 hits were top 10s in America. His first 3 were number 1. Rarely, if not ever, number 4 at that stage.
Yeah.
Yet he's performing in the Fairmont, which is out on Tavian here. There's about 5 or 6 BG songs. Well, no, maybe 3 or 4. I don't know. But he had his own career. If you look at like Wayne Newton, who had still going, he had a huge career. If you look at how many hits he had, nowhere near what Andy did. And Andy's covering Bee Gees songs.
Yeah. Well, and I shared this in another place. I can't remember where we talked about this, but in North America, I mean, I know Andy didn't have a huge following in the UK, but I Just Want to Be Your Everything and Shadow Dancing are among the top 30 the top 30 songs of all time on the Billboard charts. So, I mean, even 40 years later, after Michael Jackson's and Britney Spears and Madonna's, I mean, Andy's songs are still within the top 30 of the most successful singles of all time in America. And so not many of his contemporaries can claim that, So, and I Just Want to, those 2 songs still get played a ton on the radio. I hear them all the time. So, even though, he had such a short career, there's a shelf life that people, and I think America in particular, has a lot of empathy for Andy, and I think we're still very attached to him. And so there's some cultural stuff there.
That is good to hear.
Yeah.
Is there any one final quick question before we bring proceedings to a close?
I'm not going to cover the Sergeant Pepper film.
Oh, we ran out of time.
We've done away with it.
Because I have to say, I loved it.
The film. You were the one.
I was the one. I actually was the one in the cinema. And I went to see it. Well,
You were the only one.
You can watch the round again. When I watched the round again, I was the only one.
What do you...
Robin Gibb's vocal on Oh Darling.
Oh, yeah, that's cool.
Sublime.
I think their singing the Beatles songs wasn't really the problem. I think they did a nice job, and George Martin said that much. He said they were brilliant, right? So I don't think the music was the problem. I really don't.
But we say my view is, I think when we write in the book, that at the time it wasn't good for them, but in retrospect, it's just another tribute album, isn't it now?
Yeah.
You look back on it. So I don't think future generations, if they ever listen to that album, I don't think they'll be as judgmental as, apart from yourself. I mean, you've seen the film. You've seen the film, it's scarring, but
I used to make my children watch it when they were younger.
that's a terrible thing to do. As a punishment. As a punishment.
And it's easy to sing.
If they wanted to stay up on a Sunday night, I'd say, well, they'll watch the Sergeant Pepper film then.
That made them go to bed early.
No, they used to stay up.
So,
I was just thinking, how many...
This will be the very last
singers-
question now, folks.
I was just thinking, how many groups and singers would like you 3 to write a book on them?
Well, if you know of any, you can send them my way.
The books that you've written now, that's going to go down in history, and hopefully it may end up in the library when kids, later on, they want to read about PG.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very nice thing to say. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll give you my card later.
Yeah, thank you.
Right, well, just for me, thank you for putting up with me this evening as the sort of host. Once again, thank you very much to Andrew, Grant and Mark. Thank you.
And thank you to Dan too.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
So I can scratch that off my list. I do tend to drone on lots of when I do thank yous at the end of an event, but yes, thank you, Dan. Like sort of always our first choice. Like sort of to MC any event that we do, which have been few and far between over the past 20 years.
I know.
We need to do this more often, people.
Yes.
We really do. Just quick thank yous to those who've helped us set up this evening.
Yeah.
I don't like being my own roadie. But Luna, Hazel, and Michelle, lots of thanks for helping out with the
Cake.
with the cake.
Love the cake.
Right.
Love the cake.
And also to Nick and Jackie at the back, thanks for doing the vids and
Yes, thank
the
you.
photography.
Thank you, everybody.
We look forward to seeing the results of those. And also sitting quietly in the corner at the back there, my long-suffering wife, Judy. Thank you. She's been extremely tolerant while I've been writing these books, and I thank her for that. She's also playing host to these two gentlemen for the rest of the week.
Oh, dear.
Bless you.
They're staying with us in Holyhead, and we have another one of these book talks on Thursday. For two reasons. One, we want to do book talks, but two, to prove that I can actually organise something in a brewery. We've got a local brewery in Holyhead. It's absolutely fantastic. It's only small capacities, about 40, which is really great. But the good thing about this is we've actually got Welsh Television, S4C, interested in it, and they are coming over to actually to film the event. So we'll actually end up on the box with this one. We've also, as you've seen, from your media packs, we've actually managed to get quite a lot of decent coverage.
Yeah.
We even managed the Daily Telegraph, which is quite a result. We've got something in Shire Magazine, half page in Shire Magazine this month. Next month we've got a full page coming up in North Wales Magazine, which will feature photographs from this event.
Lovely.
And then we start on the States and Australia, don't we?
I think so. Yeah.
So
hopefully.
we're working on Good Morning America.
We'll see what happens. But
Of course, the thing is with this, it comes at a good time because Barry's got the Kennedy
Center Honours, coming up in December.
Honours coming up, so we may just be hitting the American media at a good time for coverage. Lots of in touch wood, fingers crossed, etc.
yeah. But I really want to thank, I know we all want to thank all of you too. Thank you for reading the books. Thank you for coming. It really is, we wrote these for all of you and all the fans that, love the Bee Gees as much as we do. And so the fact that folks are reading what we've written and are loving it and learning new things, and that's very, very nice. And also we're going to reprint because these have all sold out. So this is like one of the last remaining copies yet. But
60s and 70s, both. If you go to Amazon right now, you can't order them because they're still waiting for
yay for us, bad for the publisher.
Interesting. Andrew, do you want to talk about this? This was they don't normally do big books as big as this. The biggest one they've done. They were so busy during this time, we just couldn't cut it back.
Yeah.
So Andrew had to negotiate with them. It
had to be.
Yeah, the publisher actually seems to treat us quite strangely, because he says it's a monster. It costs a shed load to print, but if you need to reprint it, surely that proves that it's selling. So. You must be making some money on it.
It's like the producers.
So,
we thought he wanted to get a tax deduction. Now it's actually doing well. Oh no! You haven't seen the producers.
Yeah.
Anyway, thanks very much. Really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you.